So let's begin. Hey, yeah, thanks for joining. um, okay, so for the love of strangers, I want to talk about this. I'm just going to take some space to talk about for the love of strangers because this was a very big project. And actually, about this time last year was when it all started to come together as a possibility. And that's kind of astounding to think of like a whole year went by with idea, possibility into making it happen. And now we've closed out with the finale. So, for the love of strangers, the subtitle for that is exploring my best worst ideas for meaningfully connecting with others. Back in 2021, when I originally had the idea for the love of strangers, it was coming through a year and a half of being isolated in quarantine with COVID. So I was very much in this space of thinking, how are we going to connect? And it was I was in a dark place. Many people were. So the subtitle then, 2021, was exploring my best worst ideas for meaningfully connecting out of a no. Exploring my best worst ideas for intimately connecting out of a meaningless existence. I don't think existence is meaningless, but there was more emphasis on intimately connecting and then making meaning out of that. Once that became iterated into a public event for my community, I had to change that a little bit so that it's workshopping my best worst ideas for meaningfully connecting with others. But the heart of the matter was still true. So in that, the format basically was every month through 2025, I created a space, invited strangers in, and then shared some of my best worst ideas for meaningfully connecting with people. And those best worst ideas were, for the most part, generally very true stories of things that I'd actually done over the years. And then a handful of them are just some ideas that spun out of well, what if it looked like this? Let's talk about that and see if we can come up with a better version. Because my true stories are sometimes out there of well, why not meaningfully connect with a person like this? Or why not intimately connect with someone in this different kind of way? I think inherently there's something about breaking norms and sort of expectations of what we typically do, which is why so many people struggle with connecting with others or feeling like we have less meaning in our lives. So For the Love of Strangers became this sort of experimental community experience of, on a couple levels, saying, well, here's some fodder for conversation, an odd thing that I once did. And some people cringe, some people are inspired, and some people are like, I've done that too. Then the small groups talk about it and workshop the idea, loosely workshop. Sometimes it's just reacting to it or letting it be what initiates a conversation with people. And what do you know? The folks sort of drop into this deeper level of engagement with people who they likely do not know. Or at the very least, it's a different kind of conversation with people who maybe they are familiar with at the table. And I think it helps because it's people are talking about a story that I've offered and they don't really have to divulge so much about themselves immediately, which can be a little too vulnerable or too revealing when you're first meeting people. So I think that was part of the magic of how the whole thing worked. I got a lot of feedback month after month that what helped facilitate the space was that my stories were so out there or revealing or vulnerable that people would respond in kind to that and feel more comfortable opening up. It was so vaguely marketed that it was a self-selecting group that would come in to such a space. The kind of people who are I don't know what I'm getting into, but I'm here for it. So there's already an openness to do something different and unusual. There's a lot of elements here that I think are important that I'm kind of sitting with as I'm learning from this experience. That last part is significant, that when people are self-selecting in or identifying themselves as people who want to connect or want to learn, want to know, want to participate, then we can start somewhere differently. Or maybe when we start, something different grows from that. If you can help me, remember that. That I think will come all the way back around at the end of this little share out. So For the Love of Strangers, then, with the basic format of me telling stories, people talking about it, then we do a little, full group process and share out just to get more voices in the room. And then I just facilitate the space. We pop to new stories. It moves pretty quickly and draw some threads. But what eventually happened, which I loved, was that in a very kind of pseudo-Socratic method, a story would begin on typically a theme. The months started to carry thematic connections of the stories. So whether it's dating and relationships or parasocial relationships or therapy or work relationships. I would start with a very intentional story just to get people warmed up and talking, anticipate the likely reactions that people would respond with. Some people being like uncomfortable or like very much like I would never do that, or this brings up too many issues, or a certain question would emerge that then I would weave into the next story to kind of add another angle to it. So through the course of the evening, there's this movement of reactions and conversations and thought that hopefully my goal was always just to give people something to think about, something to talk about, and maybe something to practice. Um, but I'm really amazed. Like, one thing that I learned from doing For the Love of Strangers over the years is like, of course, it was something totally brand new. Like, I'd never seen anything like it. I don't think other people had been to anything like it. And the very first month was a little rocky, which I've really this year appreciated the nature of radical firsts and how trying to do something that's radically new for the first time is kind of awkward. A little underdetermined, but starting somewhere is important. So I am proud of like being able to step into that space, and then really grateful for the learning that happens and just continuing to do it. Like back then in December of last year when we committed to every month starting in February through 2025, the person who I was working with to like book this event space, I was like, so you have like the topics and everything worked out for each of these little shows for 11 months? And I was like, yeah, totally. Definitely. No, I didn't. And honestly, at the end of it, I'm surprised that I had like over 70 stories to share, but that's something that you learn in the process of just diving in. Like, parts of yourself were revealed. And something that became very clear to me is that apparently for a very, very long time, maybe most of my life, I've been a kind of person who does odd or unusual or unexpected strange things out of the interest and hope of connecting with people. Some of my stories that I ended up sharing were like reaching all the way back to like middle school of things that I had done, or high school. And so like it wasn't actually hard to come up with over 70 stories of things that I've done. Maybe it was vulnerable to share all of that because it's kind of a little odd or weird to do those things, but there's that level of exposure and self-learning in the process. Like, maybe this is a thing that I've done. So with that, I'll just jump all the way to the end. Last week for the finale, I was very intentional about how I wanted to end this. And because I've learned so much in the past year, not just from For the Love of Strangers, including the other spaces that I've created, but For the Love of Strangers is like this special little container, so it was appropriate. Um, the theme for the finale was love and artist. Love, comma, and artist. And I use that theme because if I had made the theme what I really wanted it to be, I think no one would have showed up for it. The theme I wanted it to be was metaphilosophical performance art. Yeah, people would not have come off of the streets to see what that theme was. But love and artist was vague enough and still true. So it worked. But that meant that the whole theme from the beginning to the end of the finale of For the Love of Strangers was really to try to like show that For the Love of Strangers is only one piece of a much larger project of mine. And the philosophical project overall that I think I'm becoming very clear on is like how to connect with people in thoughtful, meaningful ways, obviously. And so For the Love of Strangers, when we talked about all these different stories of became extra meta. Like it was the most meta, mind melting kind of For the Love of Strangers we could have done. So I started with acknowledging, like, what do we mean by meta? Unfortunately, like the Facebook empire and Zuckerberg has really ruined that for me because now when people think meta, they think that. Um, but I mean meta in the way of like the character Abed in Community is always going meta. The way that Adaptation has always been one of my favorite movies by Charlie Kaufman, starring Nicolas Cage, where a man, a screenwriter, Charlie Kaufman, is trying to write an adaptation of a book about orchids into a movie. And that is the movie. And he says, when I write this script, I don't want it to be about like love and car chases and sex and drama and drugs. I want it to just be about the flowers, but then the movie, as it plays out, becomes all those things that contain like car chases, sex and drugs and love and characters learning about themselves. So anyway, Adaptation, great, extra, extra, extra meta, beautiful masterpiece of a movie, starring Nicolas Cage playing Charlie Kaufman. And I mean meta in the way of more basically, like when people are like, we're thinking about thinking, or we're writing about writing, but from a philosophical point of view, the meta philosophy is doing the philosophy that we're talking about, or in this case, meaningfully connecting while we're talking about how to meaningfully connect. So hopefully people get it. I mean, as a former educator in a classroom, I always, you know, that like you can see when students get it if they understand that it's happening. Or I think that making a meta moment is the best way to do teaching and learning. And it sometimes rubs people the wrong way. Sometimes people get very confused if they don't see it. But when they get it, when like it clicks, that aha moment where they're like, oh, this is what we're doing, then you know that it's like reached a deeper level of understanding. So I kind of think about like meta and from like a learning perspective as like a light bulb moment. But when the light bulb goes off, you see like that the walls are mirrors. And so you're like reflecting back on what has just been illuminated. And that might be a very abstract metaphor. But so we started the finale saying this is going to be the most meta of them all because I want to tell you and share about meta philosophical performance art, the thing that I've been doing and what this has all been about. And then the third part or the next thing that I wanted to illuminate was the title, Love an Artist. So even the phrasing of that, I was trying to make a bad pun joke on my slide and I was like, love 3 ways. But people didn't laugh loud enough on that one. It wasn't about 3 ways. It was about love understood in 3 different ways. The first one being love, comma, an artist, like a sign off, like how you sign a letter, like to say, this is something that I'm giving you with love. Love me, an artist. I'm the artist, the metaphilosophical performance artist. This has been the gift for the love of stranger. Thanks, Lorraine, for the emoji, the laughing emoji. The second one was that I just wanted to introduce the definition of love that I use. I talk about it all the time, like pretty much every single week in most spaces that I'm in, which is echoing bell hooks to say that love, if we really understand love as a practice, as a project, as an effort, something that we do, I have kind of revised the definition that we get from bell hooks to say that I believe love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's healing, transformation, and liberation. And what's important about that, the will to extend oneself for a particular purpose of healing, transformation, or liberation in self or another, is that there's the will to do it. Like the will is like the choice. It's our effort, it's our project that we choose to and intend to pursue. And it involves an extension of ourselves, some effort, some striving, maybe even time over time, like a practice. But there's this will to extend oneself for a particular purpose. So I hope that that becomes like really obvious that even though I also joked and was like, For the Love of Strangers is like the most neurodivergent show and tell. I'm not getting paid for this. No one's sponsoring me to do it. I did it for free. I didn't ask for admission or prices. Like donations are very much appreciated. But like, I basically was just like, I've got this idea. I'm going to do it and make it available. It's public. Invite people into a space and they be like, here, this is what I've got. So I hope that people could see that that's very much like not an ego-oriented thing, but as much as possible, like the will to extend oneself for the purpose of, for me, extending in a way that could facilitate connection. I talked about it as like wanting to build a local culture of connection. I wanted to create spaces within my community where people could feel safe and safe enough to practice, like really being with others in ways that we engage in deeper conversation, thoughtful reflection, sharing of stories that just kind of breaks through the norms of like small talk and, you know, like bumping through the world. Bumping's an interesting word, you know, moving through the world in a way where we like miss each other a lot. So yeah, it was a project and I wanted to do it and I'm glad that I did. But ultimately, I hope that people understood that like there's a certain motivation when you do that. That's clearly not about like making money or building a business at that point, more just to share and to invite people into the experience. The third way that I talked about love is that I use a definition of, or like a describe an idea of love dynamics. And that's specifically set against power dynamics in the way that we often think about it as like kind of a struggle of power over each other, or there's like wrestling of conflict of this like contentious power dynamic. I talk about love dynamics as the practice of making space and then holding that space to see what emerges. It is, in my mind, like an application of emergent strategy. And it affords the opportunity for something unexpected, creative, radically new to be able to come through. But the practice and like the effort, the will, if you will, the will to extend oneself comes through in the project of making space and then holding space. And those two components are important because you can make the space and then it fills up and like with all the usual bullshit. Making the space and holding the space is so critical because that's where we can then have enough room for like surprise or creativity or innovation, maybe inspiration, a download. That's where I think we can have the departure of something radical, meaning like fundamentally different, present itself. So I started For the Love of Strangers, the finale, with this introduction to say, I really wanted to be about metaphilosophical performance art. Here's what I mean by meta. And love and artist is intentional because I want us to understand what I mean by love. And hopefully invite this in. And then I told these stories of like, okay, introduction, what's the best, worst idea I've done on these themes? Softball, easy launch, warm up. I was like, clearly For the Love of Strangers. Clearly, this whole project has been perhaps one of my best, worst ideas. And I do that tongue in cheek. I don't think it was a bad idea, but it's funny, right? To say, well, let's talk about this. What do you think? Creating some totally ambiguous, underdefined space monthly for people to come in and talk to each other. And, I just wanted to get people warmed up to it. But then I played with it a little bit more and was like, my next best, worst idea, literally calling myself a metaphilosophical performance artist. So I really was like, here I am, here I go. And people were like, one guy in the back, he's a marketer. And he said, no, this is too long. Those words, no one's going to get it. Which, of course, I already knew that. That's why I put the slide up that said, best, worst idea, calling myself a metaphilosophical performance artist, a branding issue. Because typically, you want people to be able to understand the words that you use. I get that. But I took the opportunity to have everybody practice another complicated word that I use and be able to say as a chorus, philosophy. So, yeah, I'm like doubling down on the neologisms here. But I said, hear me out. It's a best worst idea because I understand common sense would suggest use words people understand and would use themselves in order to be able to like connect with people, especially if it's like a branding or marketing purpose. But for the sake of revolution, from a place of abundance, I said, there's a reason here, obviously. And the reason for calling myself a metaphilosophical performance artist is to try to demonstrate the idea that what if we took it very seriously? That we have the opportunity to meet each other from a place of our gifts and talents and our strengths. What if we took it very seriously to say that actually, if I know who I am and you know who you are, like at your core, in your beauty, in your glory, in your power, in your talents, in the thing that makes you so you, that is the thing that only you can do, which I believe is our responsibility to pursue in our lives right now if we're trying to like help save each other in the world. What if we did that and we practiced meeting each other in a way that we want to see and know one another rather than, what do you do for work? Or some of the more basic questions that, yeah, can be true, but to me are not living into the possibilities of actually creating connections differently. So, that one I really liked, and then it was cute. I guess we're just going through how For the Love of Strangers happened because this is, I don't know, it was like a lovely thing. Plus, maybe it's all meta right now of me retelling it. But from there, someone was like, so we're kind of talking like about an aspirational self, I guess, like introducing ourselves with who we want to be, which is fair if you're not clear on that, like knowing of yourself, or you're not embodying that version of yourself, which is an interesting point. It did come up of like, maybe there's a reason why many people have presented with the opportunity, like, but how do you want to be known? Like, who are you? Who do you want me to see in you right now? If that's intimidating to people, or overwhelming because they're like, oh my God, I don't even know who I am, then that should raise some questions. Like, look at these conditions that we're living in where we have not nourished ourselves and each other enough to be able to readily even express that, to know that, so that when the opportunity comes and we're invited to say, how do we meet each other the way that we want to be met? If we don't have the answer for that, there's a reason for that. likely, like kind of by design. These conditions are not conducive for us to knowing each other and our power and our strength. In that case, then maybe it is kind of an aspirational self, which was just a beautiful segue. So I said, okay, let's talk about aspirational selves. Yeah. My next best worst idea was to call myself a stand up philosopher. It's like I ended up going through basically my whole website. And I love High Answer because the website was featured next. But as a best worst idea. But I said, as a stand up philosopher, the title for this little section of the evening was Make It a True Story. So I didn't actually talk about um, so much like, here I'm calling myself a stand up philosopher, and people still don't know what that is and wonder, what are you? Instead, I was telling the story of how important I think it is to do things that seed the potential, that like leave open the possibility for something to become a true story. Why not? Let's just go into it. We've got so much more to do today, but why not? Let's get into it. Here's the story that I told. This is a true story. Back in 2019, if you don't already know of this historical weekend, in one single weekend on Netflix, Brene Brown and Beyonce both dropped specials that are just, they were great. And I was high enough to watch them all at once and be fully transformed in that experience. Brene Brown dropped Call to Courage, her Netflix special. As a social work researcher, she got a Netflix special, Call to Courage. And then also Beyonce's Homecoming. If you don't know, what? Watch it. These two masterpieces, I don't know if I'd put them on par, but they were good coupled together. That is like a secret recipe for inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and believing that you could do whatever you want to do. So I, coming from that weekend, was like, yep, I guess I'm going to harness all of this energy. Thank you, Brene and Beyonce. And on Monday, the following Monday into the week, sign up for my first ever open mic spot at our local comedy club. Have I ever done it before? No. Had people told me to do open mics and stand-up comedy? Yeah. And I kind of like joked about it. I mean, I've always been interested in stand-up comedy, like as an amateur student of, like armchair comedy all my life. As a kid, growing up, high school, like I was watching stand-up with a very kind of like critical, studious lens. So here's why I did that. Because for years leading up to that, I had been telling people this long-winded pseudo story, which was that I eventually wanted to write a metafiction novel about an accidental stand-up comedian. Nope, said it wrong already. Let's start over. I wanted to write a metafiction novel about an academically trained feminist philosopher who led equity efforts in higher education and then became an accidental stand-up comedian and got a Netflix special entitled How Smoking Weed Changed My Life. If I ever wanted to have it be a true story, that should I, on some future possible timeline, ever get into comedy in a way that is legitimate, then I could actually say now, honestly, well, the first time I ever did an open mic was because of this special with Brene Brown and Beyonce's Homecoming dropping in the same weekend on Netflix, and that is what inspired me to do it. And it's true now because I did it. If I hadn't signed up, I could never tell that story and it would never be true. Who knows if I'll actually become a comedian or a stand-up comedian, an accidental stand-up comedian with a Netflix special, How Smoking Weed Changed My Life. But isn't it interesting that if you're going to make it a true story, I literally have it on my website right now that I'm a stand-up philosopher. And this fall, did. I like put it on a poster, booked an event, did 3 different events and evenings calling it stand-up philosophy, and people showed up for it. What? So it did happen in some capacity. Right now, I went from, oh, what if I wrote a metaphilosophical or fictional novel to what if I actually signed up for an open mic in 2019 to now, 2025, I have it on a website and I booked some events as a stand-up philosopher. So the theme there was make it a true story, which is just like, you gotta like, I don't know, if you have the intention, the forethought, the foresight, or the wish and desire, then you have to do the things that would eventually make it possible for that to be a true story. That one was fun. I think that was the story that like connected a lot with people. The next one was about a metafiction newsletter I didn't do, which was actually going to be called Love an Artist. That was just a historical anecdote. Nothing ever happened with that because Roxanne Gay didn't like it. But then the next one I talked about my website. And this will be the last thing I think I talk about with this one, which is weird. Maybe not. We'll keep going. The next best worst idea I presented was actually just building the website that I did. I've talked about this before. Anza of Proxy Personalized is here and helped me with it. And we went through our own process of like how to do this. But the point was like break conventions. And I broke website conventions on purpose because, as I've said on other lives here, I wanted the website to actually be something that would do something, namely present myself in a way that should someone take the time, put in the effort, have the will to read through my website, specifically my archive on my About page, then they would actually learn something about me and my work. At the very least, to be able to surmise that, like, oh, there's like stuff going on here. Or this has kind of been a thing for a while, which again was like the little mini objective of For the Love of Strangers to say, yeah, this happened for 11 months, but this is also like a thing that's part of a much bigger project that's kind of been going on for a very long time. So we talked about the website as like another meta philosophical project, namely about like how to present ourselves and become more intimate. And so then very last thing that I said, okay, this was like the worst way to end for a finale. So anticlimactic. I was like, here we are. My best worst idea that I will leave you with tonight is the precipice of my thinking. Everything I've literally ever done from the last 11 months to like the last 40 years of my life has led me to this idea, which is in 2026, I want to pursue the project of developing an epistemology of intimacy. That is still in its formulation. This is a tiny little piece, glimmer of it, maybe. But the whole idea that I'm seeing myself come to now, which at the end of 11 months and at the like edge of my thinking and learning of doing my philosophy, I'm landing on this project of developing an epistemology of intimacy. And then I did a little like philosophy lecture teaching moment of like, what do we mean an epistemology of intimacy? Two different ways. One, what do we know about intimacy? Like itself, the study of intimacy, the knowledge of intimacy, the things that we understand about intimacy as a place of knowing. And then also developing an epistemology of intimacy, meaning what we know from being intimate with one another, that being with and close to each other is actually how we learn about the world for the most part. Very little that we know and understand and what we think and believe comes from this like mythologized version of like, I'm just going to like rationally deduce myself to reality and truth in my own head. That's not how it works. That's not how we come up with knowledge. Pretty much everything that we do meaningfully in the world is transferred or created in connection with others. And so I really want to explore that. Like if we have the intimacy of deeper relationship, what does that do for the very knowledge that we even produce or come to? What can be known when we are that close and in proximity, in seeing and being seen in the relationship? And I feel like there's this page, I joke about it quite frequently, like as like a little reference, and Liberation is Local. I don't have a copy of my coloring book right here, right now, but there's a page in my coloring book that is the one that like haunts me because the page says truth is a relationship. And I made that kind of being like, I wonder what that means. I wonder if other people are going to wonder what that means. But I feel like this is kind of what like the process and the work is going to reveal is exactly that. From an epistemology of intimacy, how truth is a relationship or what comes from the relationships that we have that lead us to truth or allow us to have that relationship with it. Okay, so that was For the Love of Strangers. I'm really excited about it and happy to have done it. And it's kind of a little bit of a segue, I guess, in life of like closing that project and learning so much, seeing what happened and concluding with an event on a theme that really was like, hey, P.S., this is what I've been doing this whole time. It felt very exciting to be able to share a like a guided tour almost of the meta projects in this philosophy work that I've been doing for decades now. So, with that in mind, I'm going to do that little middle section where I pause and go to a different topic. We're going to talk about this page that came up from working relationships. And then I want to do the conclusion of like what happened in this encounter with the person yesterday that was like so moving and like really kind of shook me in a way. All right, I'm going to try to go through this page a little bit quickly. It's intriguing how this came up, and let me do a little context in case it's helpful. The context is that since about 2022, actually, I've had this other idea about working relationships. And when I present something about working relationships, let it be known that I'm talking about both personal relationships and professional relationships. Some of the work I've done has been in organizational culture and development, leadership, that kind of space. How to, like improve workplaces. But I'm a personal person and I have a lot of personal relationships, and I think about those relationships on that like intimate level and what that means for us all the time. So working relationships is kind of like what you do for work in the workplace, and also like in general, how do we make our relationships work in a healthier, more supportive, loving, like human kind of way. So working relationships is intentionally a blurry kind of title to encompass all of those realms. Within working relationships, I also have this idea that everything we do is personal is political, like the old 70s cry, like the personal is political, but also personal is political is also professional is philosophical. So what we do professionally is politically implicated. Everything has philosophical underpinnings, and our personal is not separated from any of this, the professional or political. Yada, yada, you get it. So there's like many connecting things here. All right, that's the background you need for working relationships. I've been working with a person who is expressing a very common felt experience of being like the one person trying to do things differently in an organization that says they want transformation but doesn't fully get it. And so when you push for projects or new initiatives or try to do things in a different kind of way that is more equitable or more inclusive or really trying to change systems that exist, it can be very, very hard to be in that position because you're like literally up against the culture and existing systems and even standards for evaluating work that like just does not connect in that way. So that can be exhausting. It can shake us professionally. It can shake our confidence. It can be alienating and isolating and all of those other things. Meanwhile, from this, there's this like other element that is also, I think, very true, both in a professional and a personal, political, philosophical space, which is that if we actually are meeting people who have shared practices or values, visions, the desires that we have are similar enough, it's so much easier to move with people when we start from that place. Like, for example, I already said, For the Love of Strangers works when people self-select into something that is so ambiguously described because it's so new. We don't have really anything much to compare it to. So the people who are willingly going to enter into a space on a Friday night and be like, I think I'm into this, let's see. That means that those folks are more appropriately situated to be the people to engage with than the people who like are very uncomfortable or otherwise wouldn't go. Because if they wouldn't go, then don't, I don't want to try to have to convince people or coax them or really coddle them to be able to connect with people if they're so uncomfortable connecting with strangers. The other way to think about this is like we've talked about a lot in Liberation is Local. That, and maybe like any kind of outside of the norm culture, subculture space functions well because people enter into that space with sort of shared, whether implicit or explicit agreements about what we're doing here, and then you just move differently. That's the idea. Like Liberation is Local has worked because people generally, for the most part, have entered into that space with some level of like commitment to liberation, freedom, anti-oppression, which means hopefully there's cognizance around like how to not show up in a way that is like dominating or offensive and hurtful to other people. And when that's kind of the basis of how we meet each other, we can do things differently with a lot more ease. So this page that I showed has kind of this structure here of like what it's like to be with others when when we're willing to do the work. It still requires work, but when we're willing to do the work, ideally we move more easily with those people who have kind of shared projects and purpose. Hopefully, because we appreciate both the means and the ends as relevant to the work. Like it's not just what we're trying to do, it's how we're going to do it together that really like imbues the quality of our experience and what we're trying to do. I put like building community with the conditions to create a shared culture. But we still have to practice it. Like I don't want to make that sound like it's not, or I don't want to make it sound like it's easy because it still requires work. It's still effort. We still have to do it. Um, and that is something that we have to have like a willingness and an openness to be constantly learning with others. And that is kind of like how we literally embody the practice of being with each other differently, building this different culture. So what happened, this is like the key little bing idea that came out of this that I wanted to emphasize for the group and anybody who cares about this page, is that even when we're doing something new, even when we're with people who have similar like aligned values and commitment to being in the practice of doing things differently together, I think it's fair to still wonder, like, are we doing this right? Are we on the right path? Is this going where we are hoping it to go? When you're kind of like forging something new, it can be hard to evaluate and really assess like if we're on the right path. So I was on a walk a while ago and I had this idea come to me where I was like, oh my gosh, like I know what it's like to be in the process of doing something new. And part of how I've established like a sense of confidence or faith or trust that like this is the right thing, even though I'm like deeply learning, very much transgressing into like new places. What happens is that hopefully new questions emerge. And I wanted to emphasize that like it's the quality of the questions, that if those are questions that present themselves and we go, I do want to know the answer to that one, or that is worth exploring. They can be challenging, they can confront us, they might reveal like something, we didn't anticipate, but it's good to have questions that are good questions, you know? I think we know that we're not on the right path, that we're not really doing it. If the questions we're encountering are like the questions that keep us stuck and stagnant. I'm thinking about that in terms of like the relationship dynamic of like, what do we need to do to get you on board is not a very encouraging question. That's not going to be indicative of something else. But if something brand new comes up where you say like, oh, this is exposing a completely different possibility that I hadn't even encountered before. What happens if I explore this element of like myself with you? And is that something we want to pursue and investigate? Like, then that becomes like generative. It's a fruitful kind of question that it illuminates more movement forward rather than like the question of why am I hitting my head against the wall? That might seem like a really reductive example, but I think it's like good for us to be oriented to pay attention to the questions that emerge in the process. Because I think there will always be new questions. It's like a creative process. If you're in it, if you're really like in your flow, or like making art, we use the example of cooking a meal. There might be this like little moment of like, ooh, what about that? That you wouldn't have even had the, ooh, what about that moment if you weren't in it, Like to be creating a creative, artistic piece of anything, the surprise of like, oh, and then you try it is what kind of compels the movement forward. So that's what I'm meaning about like pay attention to the questions that emerge. Do they helpfully illuminate a way to continue more moving toward the answers you want to know? Yeah, that was that. I think there was more, but I'm gonna let that sit for now. Um, the this part here is actually kind of describing the tension of being with others, creating new things, and having these questions be the questions that we want to know and want to pursue. That's a good indication. But, when you're trying to do things differently, which is the whole point, we still we'll have to navigate and negotiate like these tensions, the complicated places. So here, maybe I'll just read a little bit of this. I'm talking about this is the voice of like maybe this person I'm working with and other people who are in their position. How do I build the confidence to stay true to my values? especially when I'm pushing against the norms and culture and entire systems that haven't just been built in ways that create harm and perpetuate inequities, but are themselves largely guided by standards that are dissonant with who I am trying to be to help create the world I really want and believe in. My efforts are judged and evaluated by people and metrics that can hardly comprehend what I'm trying to do, let alone effectively support the methodology, which is a how, rooted in doing things very differently. So this is kind of like the situatedness of where someone might feel this tension. And so, yes, even though it is so important to be with others where we have like a shared premise and assumption about we want to be in this work together and know that will be a process of learning and continuing to like uncover new questions and then continuing to pursue those answers, there's still something here. And what I wrote here is that like in all of our configurations and relationships, regardless of positive or negative, praise or criticism, you will always need to be able to return to some small corner inside of yourself, that space where the only thing you can hear is your inner voice. And you need to learn how to hear it, how to listen, how to heed it, and how to trust that voice. I'm just going to keep going. But I wrote, perhaps this sounds like a lonely space, a place to which no one else has access, where only you can be present. But may you make this a loving space, a tender place that is always available to you, where the depths of your knowing and feeling can be held and given room to be true without any conditions. Go here as frequently as you need so that you trust what it means to really be free. In that, you maybe hear some echoes of things that I've already kind of talked about. At least in that last part too, like may you make this little corner inside of yourself where it's really only your voice. Like I think we all have that, and maybe sometimes it's scary to go there, or maybe sometimes it doesn't feel like it's enough to be there. But like I've learned, especially lately, how much I need to trust that voice. And at times it does feel lonely. But also that little final conclusion here, may you make this a loving space, a tender place that is always available to you, where the depths of your knowing and feeling can be held and given room to be true without any conditions. That hopefully sounds like love dynamics of making space and holding space for like that voice to really be there. And it was interesting. I was like, oh, surprise. Little things happen when you're in a creative process. Go here as frequently as you need so that you trust what it means to really be free. That to me raises the question of like, can we even really be free within ourselves? Is that a space for us to have an experience of freedom and liberation that we hopefully can create with ourselves? There's a lot going on here. There's a lot going on here because I told the group on Sunday, like, I don't want this to sound like an individualistic kind of thing where, like, it's all about you being you, only for you, alone by yourself. That's never what I'm trying to do. But I do think that there's something important about our capacity to, like, even find room enough within ourselves for us to have this experience of being free, that if we can't do that for ourselves in a loving way with this, like, little tiny inner corner of who we are, in our voice, like hold that tenderly, then, ooh, then yikes. I mean, of course it's going to be hard to do that for other people. And it might be hard to trust that other people could do that for us too. So this is like a muscle to build, to strengthen and something to practice. And the final thing I'm going to say about this, because I do think it's important, is that I added here, even in this, and especially in this part where the being with others or the inner corner of ourselves, I made the little note as a reminder of like from a place of liberation. Now, I presented this on Sunday in the space of Liberation is Local, where the whole idea of that weekly gathering is for us to be in a learning process, like consistent, ongoing, long-term learning process with others, where what we are learning together is what liberation looks and feels like, where we become so much more familiar and intimate with like what liberation really is, that it becomes something we could practice and not just some word that becomes popular because we know oppression is bad. I don't want it to be abstract. I want it to be concrete. I want liberation to be something that we know and feel and embody and do and learn and then create and build together because we know what we're doing. And I don't think we can do that if we don't put in the work of the learning, especially learning with others, to create well, what do we say? To build community with the conditions and create a shared culture that is actually like grounded in this sense of we understand what we're trying to do here, and we have some semblance of a clue of what that would look like to do it from a place of liberation. That's with others, but also especially with ourselves too. So even that like tiny little inner corner of ourselves. Again, I'm not trying to make it this individualistic thing where like you be you no matter what, you're good. Like sometimes we need to work on ourselves. I think that's fine. But we can even do that from a place of liberation, like from a place of love, the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own healing, transformation, and liberation would fit there. So from a place of liberation was just the reminder, like the big old caveat on all of this, that whatever it is that we're doing, if we do it from a place of liberation, that hopefully also changes the quality of what we're working on and through and how we do it. Someone in the group asked, like, what is that phrasing that you always say? And I'll just give it here now for the sake of convenience. But the phrasing that I always say that has developed over a year and a half of liberation is local is for us to move with love from a place of liberation, even in these conditions, and actually, especially in these conditions. We could add on to that now to like ask the sort of questions you want to know the answers to, which is another page in the coloring book, um, which is like a close connected kin to pay attention to the questions that emerge while we're on this path of discovery. Because if they're the questions we want to know the answers to, then maybe we keep going and take that as indication that we're in a good process of learning and transformation and maybe even healing and liberation. Better if we can do that together. Important for us to also be able to like navigate that within ourselves too. So now we are approaching an hour, and I'm going to try to keep this around an hour today. Um, but my third and final thing that I wanted to share, I think, is going to be really special because I believe this person maybe just joined this call. So this is suddenly now, it's a call, this broadcast, but this is suddenly going to be like a very, I don't know, poignant. Maybe you'll know this just got a lot richer, a lot deeper, and I can feel myself blushing because of it. So what I wanted to say is that after creating a page like this and talking about it with a group on Sunday about what it means to be with others and how to move from this place of like shared assumption, understanding, like I use other language of that, of talking about like be with the people who get you and get what you're trying to do rather than trying to convince everybody else to get on board. Like that's not the work. I do not feel like that's the work. I feel like there's a drain on our energy, drain on our attention and resources, and could be one of the tools of the oppressors if you're like thinking about there's a poem in this bridge called My Back, like called The Bridge, where there's a specific line that's like, I am not going to be making myself the person who makes you better. I have my projects I need to do. And that's where I'm going to be focusing my energy, because it might just be oppression replicating itself when everybody else who's like, we don't get it, make us better, put it in my terms, teach me how to do it, is just detracting from the force and power and strength and creativity and the richness that we need to really be like liberating ourselves and others. That's the dynamic that's at play here. So I wanted to like, well, I'm all over the place, but that's kind of why the alternative, being with others in a shared way, is so crucial, and why that makes things a lot easier. Even the work of trying to do things differently, which can still be challenging, it's still different when you're doing it with people who are like of like mind and goals and assumptions. Okay, so here's the story of how I want to end. Last night, I was thinking after a 2-hour conversation with a stranger online, and I was thinking a lot about what it takes for us to begin a relationship. Now, that's like putting the conclusion at the preface. Here's what I'm talking about. Someone recently reached out to me, hello, via my website with a question that wasn't very well formed, but basically was like, I don't know you, I don't know what you do, but I think you're the person I need to talk to. I have some ideas. Can we connect? And so I asked like some follow-up questions and just said, why don't we set up like a virtual call and we'll see what it is that you're really trying to explore. So that virtual call happened yesterday, and it could have been a 15 or 30 minute little chat to see like if it's appropriate for us to work together or not. But what it turned into was a 2-hour call. And I just want to share, I'm going to share my experience. This is a story that I can offer. What I was so moved to learn and see from this person was this is a person who has not had the support of community or formal teachers or formal education to make sense of what is not okay in the world. But as a person, and I think this is true for so many of us, as a person, when you live in spaces at the junctures of systems that are marginalizing, that are harmful, you develop a critical view of like, this is not working for me. Clearly, it's hurtful for me and people like me. So there's this automatic, like, sort of inherent critical lens that you can develop to say, this system is messed up and not helpful. This is why inequities happen. This is why it's painful. And it should and could be done differently, right? Right? Yes, definitely. So this is a person who was like, from my lived experience, truly the most like, I know how this has gone for me. I can say things could be different and there are problems operating here. She reached out and was like, am I crazy? Or is this an idea like that I have that like makes sense? Because I'm trying to put these pieces together and in a way that's like, this is what's going on. I see it. I see what you're doing. And I really want us to be able to do it differently. And I just have to say that, like, part of what was so moving for me in this conversation with her, it was like incredibly humbling to meet somebody squarely in this moment of like raw frustration and rage and determination and like passion and conviction that like things have to be different. They could be different. And then the sheer will, the willpower to try to put together these ideas, to make an analysis, to say these are the pieces I'm noticing and I'm putting them together to try to make some coherent like take on what's happening, and want to suggest from like that deep source of like humanity, like it could be different and better. And that's ultimately the goal here. It was so incredible because like I know that place. I've been in that space. And I think so many of us have. It's kind of that like coming to consciousness moment when you're just like wanting to put the pieces together to make sense of the world. And that's precisely the reason why I have gotten into philosophy and done what I've done for 20 years. Because when I finally encountered a teacher in college, I had the privilege of meeting a teacher who finally spoke to the issues that like always bothered me about social political realities, that always had people in my community being like, oh, you're such a commie hippie, that like made people feel like they could critique me because I was so counter the norms growing up. I finally had a teacher who presented the issues and with questions that weren't just like pointing out the problems, like, yes, this is the discrepancies of incarceration rates based on race. And yes, this is the poverty and how that plays out in our society. Like, I already knew all of that. That's why I'm so mad. But someone was asking questions and exploring the issues in a way that was critical and thoughtful and theoretical enough that I was like, this is what I'm needing. This is speaking in a way that is helping me understand why, what, and now because of that, how. It's not just saying this is an issue. It's saying this is why it's an issue, and these are the factors that build that into the reality. And now, with that sense of understanding, now here is what good theory does. Good theory situates you with a place of knowing where you're located so that you can make sense of the world and identify where you have a responsibility to change it, to do it better. If a theory does not situate us with any kind of path forward, it's not a good theory. This is coming directly from the essay that I have referred to in other spaces. It was the inspiration for actually most of my work, but especially feminist friendship, the course that I taught, which became like a version of a TED Talk. It's not very good. Anyway, Elizabeth Spellman, Marie Lagones wrote Have We Got a Theory for You? Back in like 1987. And they do a lot about like feminist work in that essay, but they also are doing like kind of analysis of what makes good theory. It's not even true or false necessarily that makes something good. Something could be true and it's a shitty theory because it doesn't actually give us any path forward. So they say, some good theory can be that which makes us laugh. Like there's all these other qualities and elements that make theory good. And one of the most important things that I would say is that any kind of reflective theoretical engagement should be that which transforms us enough to know that we have the capacity and the responsibility and the power to be able to make things different too. I have always said thinking through life in transformative ways. That was like my old tagline. Now I'm talking about learn how to be who we need, but everything is still grounded in this basis of like, we have insight and resources and perspectives and frameworks available for us to help us make sense of the world, understand ourselves and each other more clearly and more critically so that we know how to do things differently, so that we can take those steps. I'm kind of on a tirade right now because in our conversation, to go back to like the emotional component of what was so moving, I tried to tell this person, like, you are so right to be so mad at how things are going. And it is a very reasonable thing to feel like you are crazy because people are not seeing or doing things in a way that makes it different. But I said, but you're not alone. And that's the most important thing that I wanted to impart, to say, you're not alone. You're not the only one who's thought this. And thank goodness you don't have to put in that massive amount of will to try to come up with this full, like, comprehensive analysis of the world and why it is the way that it is in your own space, in your own head, because there are so many people who have been on this path before you, who have put in the work to make these resources and these frameworks and these ideas something that you can work with now too. So we ended up being on the phone for 2 hours because in the way of telling my own personal story of like how I got into philosophy and why I am so passionate about it and what has motivated my projects for the past 20 years online, making it publicly available, making it publicly accessible, talking about issues that really like matter to us. I started that with epistemology because when I was introduced to certain concepts like the epistemology of ignorance, which is like, what the fuck? Not only is the way of the world totally messed up, but we are literally producing ignorance so that people will not see that clearly in order to maintain the structures that cause so much harm and violence and oppression. The epistemology of ignorance has always been the key concept that like changed my whole life. Once I saw that, which was presented by Charles Mills in The Racial Contract around global white supremacy and why the past like 500 years have been as they are, and white people, I call them people of whiteness, cannot seem to understand that. It's because of this like way of thinking about epistemology of ignorance. But I told this person, I was like, Charles Mills was a Marxist. He's actually operating out of standpoint theory. Standpoint theory is something that was adopted by feminist theorists to say, from our vantage point, being the ones who are taking care of people, family, the sick, the elderly, the people who are holding together communities, from our vantage point of being those who are limited in opportunities, being mistreated because of our situatedness in these systems. Our standpoint is the very thing that gives us this critical perspective to be able to say, here's what's really going on here. And pathways outside of that too. It's Marxist coming from, the worker, the laborer, that there's a certain vantage point. The standpoint theory is what produces a perspective. Feminists took it on. Charles Mills did it about race. I was like, the epistemology of ignorance is such a helpful concept that I started to understand other social dynamics and realities from that. And so I gave the examples of like the truth about like sexual assault and rates of sexual assault, that it's not just men jumping out of bushes who are going to be the strangers to perpetrate violence in the middle of the night. No, the reality is that so many people who are victims of sexual assault are victimized by people that they know in their families, in their relationship, their fucking spouse, or their children, who are some of the most disempowered, the least supported, the least protected people in our society now. especially children with disabilities. Like, these are the most vulnerable populations. But when we talk about sexual assault, we're talking about getting roofied at a bar instead of talking about where that actually happens. That's a production of ignorance that maintains that system because people aren't looking at the right thing. It's like being distracted by a red herring so that the powers that be can continue operating in really fucked up, problematic ways. I've used the epistemology of ignorance to understand abortion, something I'm super, super passionate about, and namely because the amount of ignorance that has been produced around abortion, what it actually is, the practice, the medical necessity of it, the prevalence of it, why it saves lives and communities and economies, even if that's your bent. Like, there's so much that people do not know about abortion, but instead are told this mythology about the worst possible kind of story that people will not even talk about when they've had experience of abortion for political reasons. You know who gets abortions? Conservatives, Christians, families, people with kids already, like, also have abortions. And it's not all this like biased stereotyping that is created as a narrative to undermine access to abortion. These are just examples of how an epistemology of ignorance is produced. So I'm telling this person, like, one, that's my story. That's how I got into philosophy, because that was a concept that just like, oh, blew open a whole realm of perspective, a new way of seeing things that was very, very encouraging, empowering, and like just so motivating for me to be like, the world is starting to make sense in a different kind of way. But when you're a person who's sitting struggling, like mad as hell, and like so beat down by all of these things that keep us, when you don't have access to teachers or classes or concepts that could be empowering for you, why do you think the first thing that so many fascist governments go after is education? Bell Hooks said it, education is a practice of freedom, teaching to transgress. Like, this is why we need to be learning with each other and making things available. Because if you're stuck, isolated and alone, trying to muscle through making sense of reality, that is exhausting, hard, just draining work that is so important. Sometimes it feels like it's what we have to do for survival, but we shouldn't have to do that alone. So I'm telling this person, guess what? If we study epistemology, how we know, what we know, why we know, or not, that I think is the fundamental like foundation for building so much more knowledge that can be really liberatory and transformative, because everything comes around what we know. We shape our own realities based on the assumptions and the biases that we have. Our entire like worldview is shaped by things that we assume to be the building blocks of reality. Your cosmology of whether or not you think the land is alive or a resource to be extracted from is a reflection of an epistemological framework. Like, your knowledge is going to produce the ways that you relate to things, what you do, the world you create or destroy in the meantime. So I said, you know what? Here's more information. Let's talk about it. There are other concepts, and I'm going to stop on this little rant soon. But the other concept I shared was the epistemic injustice of like, if we actually do not have language or we don't even have concepts to make sense of our experiences, that has hugely important political consequence. So Miranda Fricker is the person who wrote Epistemic Injustice back in the mid 2000s. And she uses these concepts to say, if we don't have language, then we can't have a shared connection around our experience either. So the classic example that I think she is referring to is like sexual assault. No, scratch that. Sexual harassment in the workplace. That up until like the 70s and 80s, I mean, people were being sexually harassed at work all the time, and it was the norm, and it was just something that you dealt with. But once it was named, then people are like, oh, this is something we can actually identify and now track and connect over and say, that's my experience and that's your experience too. So if we were actually to talk about things with the language that connected us to say, here's what we're really talking about, then that shifts the whole paradigm. We can support each other. We can build power together. We can organize around that because we have something that binds us that is still always been true in our experience, but now we have the means to be able to connect. So if we lack the concepts and the language to even make sense of our own experiences, that has political consequences personally. It can be devastating to us personally, make us feel isolated, alone, and crazy. And it has collective consequence because it prevents us from being able to actually like organize and mobilize together in a more comprehensive kind of way. This is making sense, right? I think. All of that is to say that that conversation moved me so much. Like, there were times we were both in tears. And I just was like, I want you to know that there are lineages of people. I have been shaped by women, radical feminist thinkers and artists and poets and philosophers that like these are the people who I claim to have shaped me. Like those are my teachers. These are the mentors. The person I am is because of everything that all these people have done. It's parasocial for the most part because it's all through books, because it's through theory, because it's through learning. But it doesn't mean that it is only intellectual. The relationship of self to knowledge through the gifts of other people from history, generations, is something that can ground us in a way that I think is necessary and is sort of whispering at some of the elements that I think are present when I talk about exploring an epistemology of intimacy. So here's this last thing. I'm not getting into the epistemology of intimacy right now. Again, this is like what I think is the big project moving forward, and I'm so excited about it. But what came up for me in that conversation yesterday was a little bit more clarity around what I think I want to do and am situated to do moving forward with my work around my philosophy. I'm getting clarity on that. I reviewed my notebook from the past 3 months, and so much surfaced from it. But the biggest question that challenged me from that 2-hour call yesterday that I was thinking about last night is how we begin a relationship and what it means for us to commit to starting something new. Now, this is going to sound almost a little contradictory to what I was talking about earlier, because what I ultimately realized was like, I mean, fuck, I needed it. I needed the reality check. I needed the reminder. I needed the human person on the other end of a call to feel with them what it's like to be in that raw space of like feeling like you're just starting here. I take it for granted that I've been supported and fed and nourished for decades by voices of such brilliant people throughout history that I've had access to that. And then the time and the discipline and my own lifestyle of like being with them. I feel fed with fortitude because of so much that I've been just like, this is my life. I do it. I'm a philosopher. But there's this other experience when you're just beginning that I remember. I know what that felt like. And people are still there. That raw, just heat of frustration that you know something is different or it could be different and you know things are wrong. That like, I think I've been biased in lately of wanting to be with people who know how to show up in a space together. You know, the whole like bridge metaphor, like, nah, I'm going to be here because you're meeting me here and we can like do things differently. There's nuance there and it's different. But what I saw is something really important of the shared connection of the passion and the want and the will. And honestly, I was impressed to say for someone to be like, I have no formal education. I have not been studying this like deeply. I don't have anybody around me who's encouraging me and validating my thoughts, which is partly why they reached out. That level of like intense commitment and conviction to still stand by your own like judgments and evaluations of what's wrong in the world is admirable. Truly. So I was moved by that. And I'm thinking that is worth something. Of course, that's worth something for people to feel that convicted and impassioned just from the like depth of your gut, knowing that like it doesn't have to be this way and something is wrong. We should do it. We should fix this. That to me feels like maybe that is an important thing to also share when we're going, where am I? This part of being with others in like a shared space. It's interesting because we're not moving with the same fluency or language and vocabulary. Thinking of like concepts and language like epistemic and justice. And I mean, maybe I'm revealing too much. Like, obviously, we need to be able to meet people where they're at in a certain kind of way. I have issues with that because sometimes meeting people where they're at is used to detract from progress. It's used like by people who consciously or not are obstructionists. But I didn't get that feeling from this person. Instead, it was a really powerful reminder that sometimes it's appropriate for us to start from the beginning of like, here's the original concept that changed my life. This is maybe where you can start too. And maybe it's not for everybody, but this is my story that I can offer you. This is square one for me. And I started to reflect on like anytime we meet a person, no matter the context, not just like philosophical or thoughtful, like intellectual study, but anytime we meet a person, maybe consciously or not, there's like this choice we have to make of, am I willing to begin this thing with you? And this is maybe sounding really vague, but like I'm sitting with the feeling of like what happens at the beginning if there's a conscious attention to it being a very beginning, which means, yeah, everybody comes in with all of their life experience and all of their stories. But there's something about how to start with another person that it's like, it's so nascent, it's so new just because of this encounter yesterday that I'm sitting with it clearly, like pretty undefined. But I want to hold on to like maybe hold space for something to come through around how we can be in a beginning moment with people because we can't just always be beginning always something new. For me, I'm so committed to the process that like I do think there's a choice we can make when we begin something, just like in a relationship. If we commit, then we're in it. But I'm curious about what that looks like on a lot of different levels outside of the standard way of thinking about like a committed partnership or like working together on a project. We're going to start this thing. Like, I don't know, there's something really potent and it feels really powerful to me right now to have a sense for choosing to begin from a true place of like original start beginning. And then the commitment and the will of like, am I really willing to do this with you? Are you really willing to do this with me in this kind of way? And I mean this kind of abstractly. I'm not just talking about this person from the encounter, but like, I'm thinking about 2026 as I'm saying an epistemology of intimacy or any kind of project that we might pursue. Like maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm just in a place of rethinking what it means to begin something and how like truly original the start has to be for that. Maybe it's so radical of a start. I don't know. Okay, those are my musings. We ended on a place of really like the freshest, realest part of my own process right now because this is less than 24 hours old for me. But um isn't that what this is for? These live weekly updates. Truly updating the process as it's unfolding, and sharing what just comes up week after week. Because the truth of the matter is always, like I've said, for me in my process, 1 week is too full. So much happens in a week, and hopefully you can see that. And I just needed a place to like put that out. Um, and I'm excited because I can hear myself also tracing these little like channels and threads that are revealing themselves already to be what is going to come next in 2026. So I'm excited about the epistemology of intimacy. I think it will still be romancing the revolution. I think it will have something to do with working relationships. I for sure know that somewhere in there is going to be my philosophy. And everything that has been coming up lately about vulnerability continues. People keep talking about vulnerability and bravery and exposing ourselves and risk. And I'm front and center always thinking about like parasocial relationships, which is a fundamental question of intimacy. Like what's possible from a relationship that is ultimately parasocial? But that's the way I relate to Bell Hooks. That's the way I relate to Audre Lorde. That's parasocial too. That doesn't mean that it can't still be powerful and revolutionary or necessary for us to be moving in the ways that we want to be who we need, and still connect with each other in meaningful ways in light of that. That's my word spew. That's all I'm going to say now. I'm going to end it. Thank you so much for joining and for watching or listening. Thank you for supporting me in this process and being a part of it. Again, I don't know what it's going to look like, but if you want to be a part of it, it's always subscribing to Want to Know is the way to do it. If you want to support this work, you can also support me in many ways. Share my content or follow along or buy me a coffee or, just keep showing up and be a part of this. Last thing I'll say is that these pages that I'm making for working relationships and sharing liberation is local are always available week after week. I'm putting them in the chat of my Substack, Want to Know. So you can get that there and even go back to what we've been doing since August. Okay, thank you. Have a good day. Have a good week. See you next time.